Hello, welcome. My name is Brian Becker, and this is the first of a new series entitled Back to the Text Themselves, a YouTube series on the major works of phenomenology. In this video, I will describe what this series is about, define what I mean by phenomenology, and discuss the approach I'll take in this series. If you learned something from this video and want to support this work, please consider liking it, sharing it, and subscribing to my channel. If you're familiar with my other series on Lacan, you'll have a sense of what to expect in terms of style and format. However, rather than focus on one thinker, this series closely examines texts by several. We'll dive deeply into concepts and arguments developed by the great minds of phenomenology. Like my other series, I'll organize the content of each video according to 3 questions that emerge for me while reading the text. In the early going of the series, we'll spend a good deal of time on the 2 major figures associated with phenomenology, Edmund Husserl and Martin Heidegger. From there, we'll branch out, such as with the existentialism of Jean-Paul Sartre, the hermeneutics of Hans-Georg Gadamer and Paul Ricoeur, phenomenologies of the social and political, such as with Simone de Beauvoir and Hannah Arendt. Phenomenologies of the body with Maurice Merleau-Ponty and Michel Henry, the notion of difference with Jacques Derrida, and phenomenologies of the ethical and religious with Emmanuel Levinas and Jean-Luc Marion. This list will likely shift and expand over time. Already, perhaps you observe that there are certain ambiguities and disagreeable inclusions and perhaps even exclusions here. I've named some thinkers who do not consider themselves to be phenomenologists, and others who consider themselves to be doing phenomenology when others do not. This requires clarifying how I'm using and applying the label of phenomenology in the series. One way I think about this classification is in terms of anyone whose primary interlocutors are Husserl and Heidegger. What would this exclude? Well, it would exclude much of critical theory and genealogical analysis. It also excludes those who ground their thought in structuralism and anthropology. You may notice that there are a lot of fuzzy boundaries here. So Sartre is strongly influenced by Hegel, and Derrida, who's perhaps the most surprising inclusion, is deeply engaged with structuralism. But for Derrida, there's also an explicit and profound dialogue with Husserl and Heidegger. For this reason, I would include him, but not Baudrillard or Lyotard. One supporting source of scholarship for who I include in this series is Dermot Moran and his text Introduction to Phenomenology and the Phenomenology Reader. At the same time, I do seek to go beyond his list to include a few more thinkers, perhaps less recognized within the phenomenological tradition, such as Frantz Fanon and Sarah Ahmed. Another criterion I consider is whether the thinker employs or is in conversation with certain central concepts that derive from phenomenology. This includes terms such as intentionality, intuition, givenness, bracketing, lived experience, constitution, and especially the distinction between the appearance and the act of appearing. For many, phenomenology is an obsolete philosophy, one that remains tethered to the modern subject and presents a problematic notion of consciousness, that it's perhaps individualistic in its first-person orientation, and that it has not withstood the criticisms of structuralism, post-structuralism, and critical theory. Phenomenology has been interpreted as a variant of idealism and even as ideology. No quick rejection of these objections can be given, but what I would suggest is that such critiques are more applicable in some cases than in others. Phenomenology is a far more vast and diverse discipline than it's typically portrayed as. And part of our work in this series is to see if we can discern a thread of commonality among all the differences within this discipline, without covering over those legitimate differences. I have a few specific reasons why phenomenology, in my opinion, remains a viable philosophical option. These reasons would require much elaboration to justify them, so for now I'll just posit them here. First and foremost, I consider phenomenology to be a kind of orientation, sensibility, and activity, more so than a set of doctrines. As a practice, it cultivates an open as well as discerning attention to the world that ceaselessly requires an examination of our own assumptions. Assumptions so tacit and so immediate that they are frequently mistaken for the things themselves. It's an orientation that rigorously and endlessly brackets the innumerable abstractions that we impose upon life. Second, phenomenology makes possible the philosophical study of everything that can be described, even up to the point of describing the encounter with the indescribable. Nothing is forbidden or prohibited a priori. Everything, by the very facticity of its appearance, acquires the right of legitimacy for phenomenological analysis. Consequently, phenomenology respects the circumscribed legitimacy of all existing forms of knowledge, sciences, and philosophical systems, except to the degree they impinge upon and preemptively restrict the possibility of certain phenomena to be described. And it's for this reason I can operate within both phenomenology and Lacanian psychoanalysis, despite many, if not most, believing that these fields are diametrically opposed. And indeed, to the degree one understands phenomenology as a study of the structures of consciousness or as purely focused on lived experience, and the degree that one understands Lacan as a structuralist, a Hegelian, a Freudian, then they probably would be correct. And that is often the standard reading, but I believe phenomenology is not to be restricted to consciousness, nor the study of lived experience, despite how odd that might sound to some ears. And I consider Lacan a masterful phenomenologist who offered some of the most profound phenomenological analyses of language and subjectivity. Of course, as a phenomenologist, I cannot accept every theoretical decision Lacan makes, but it's always because it oversteps the bounds of what can be said within the circumscribed field of phenomenology. Just as I cannot accept a scientist who enters into metaphysical questions, such as how something came from nothing, positing a scientific answer to a philosophical question. That scientist is not respecting the limits set forth by the scientific method, but uses the authority granted to it to make claims that reside outside the scope of that method. Now, I entered phenomenology not through the traditional route of obtaining a philosophy degree, but through psychology and religion. My interest in religious phenomena in particular drew me to a group of phenomenologists from France who make up what is called the theological turn in phenomenology. I don't particularly care for that label, but it's stuck as a way of identifying a set of relatively contemporary philosophers whose phenomenological approach intersects greatly with religious and theological matters. Though this is the orientation I tend to find myself attracted to, this series will not be focused on the phenomenology of religion. Rather, my aim in these videos is to rigorously present the major questions, concepts, and arguments of the texts of phenomenology in a manner that's clear and can be appreciated by those without expertise in the field of philosophy, though it will probably help to have some basic background knowledge. I hope to do so also while seeking not to misrepresent or egregiously oversimplify these texts. Finally, though these videos are best watched in sequential order, I aim to make them in such a way that they can be self-contained topics. And so if you're interested only in certain concepts but don't wish to watch every video, though I can't imagine why you wouldn't, you should be able to identify what you're seeking in the title as well as keywords provided in the description. A final comment on this series. My aim is primarily to describe and not criticize. Faithfully presenting what a text says entails a certain phenomenological sensibility. It requires suspending as much as possible my own assumptions and biases in order to let the text speak to me, to hear what it has to say to me. This is the reason for the series title, Back to the Texts Themselves, which is a playoff of Husserl's famous expression, back to the things themselves. What I say in my videos will always be a coming together of the text voice with my own. My hope is that my own voice does not drown out the voice of the text, but there will be moments of contradiction between the two. I will try to identify those moments and speak to them. What I will seek not to do is to lead with criticism, to impose my voice on the text before adequately hearing it. It's far too often the case, even or perhaps especially among philosophers, that the text is read with an eye for criticism in a manner that amounts to mere polemics. Despite criticism usually being considered a higher order form of textual analysis, it can, in fact, be very easy to level critique against a text, idea, or philosopher. I believe what is far more difficult is to faithfully describe what the text says. When we begin with faithful description, critique then can be more powerful and convincing. And so in the next video, we begin to work through our first text. It would make sense to begin with Husserl's logical investigations. However, I'm going to first examine Martin Heidegger's Being and Time. I do this for two reasons. First, I believe it's the most important philosophical text of the 20th century. My second reason is a practical one. I want to leave a favorable impression to new viewers and listeners interested in phenomenology. It's simply more challenging to do that with Husserl's text. The disadvantage of this move is that it will be more difficult to fully appreciate the context of being and time to the degree it deploys Husserl's terms and is in debate with his work. I'll try to supplement that background when I can. After going through being and time carefully, we'll then move backwards to Husserl. Thank you for watching. Now it's time to go back to the text themselves. I'll see you in the next video where we will consider part 1 of the introduction to being and time. Until then, be well.